Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for some of you out there. My name is Tony Walters. I'm the Executive Director here at NAHC. I think we'll get started today. It's a pretty similar agenda to what we have on these monthly calls. Hopefully you all got the notices. Hopefully some of you used the survey to ask questions. When I checked it this morning, I didn't see any. So if you did use it, let me know in the chat, or feel free to ask your questions in the chat as well. We are being recorded, so just so folks know that we're going to post this probably tonight or first thing tomorrow morning. So people who can't join us live today will still be able to get to watch and hear some of the updates that we'll be sharing today, and some of the questions that hopefully you guys have that we can talk about. I know there's a lot of things going on with rental assistance funding, various consultations efforts going on right now that we'll chat about a little bit today. And like always, happy to answer any questions that you guys have, or open it up for group discussion as we go through the agenda. I would invite a lot of you to say hello, or say where you're from in the chat feature, rather than doing a roll call here. We record these so we can kind of see who joins these meetings, so we don't necessarily need to go through a full roll call. So we have a pretty good group today joining us. So I think we'll just jump right into the agenda. I am trying to watch the chat as well, so if there are any questions, I'll be able to see those and respond as necessary. So let's go into the agenda. We typically start the discussion by talking about Congress, what it's up to right now. As many of you are aware of in the news, the biggest issue that Congress is working on now is another COVID relief package. It's a very large package, $1.9 trillion overall. So that's really what Congress is focused on right now. I think since our last call, there was also an impeachment trial in the Senate, so there wasn't a lot of other business being conducted there. But since then, both the House has already passed their version of this COVID relief package. It's got a lot of substantial funding for tribes and tribal programs, which we'll talk about here in a second. And right now it's pending with the Senate, where we expect to see a few changes and then before it gets kind of finalized either later this week or early next is the estimated time frame that we've been hearing. The House would have to approve it again if there are changes, and then President Biden would have to enact the bill as well. So I'll go through some of the portions of that COVID relief package that we're seeing. Hopefully you all can see the screen for those of you on the webinar. That does have a lot of funds for tribal housing, specifically NAHASDA funding. $750 million is part of the package. This was largely due to the fact that they are putting in another rental assistance group of funds that we all received back in the December-January timeframe. Another COVID relief package that was enacted right at the turn of the year. We've heard a lot of issues and concerns from tribes being able to spend that specifically on rental assistance and not having any flexibility there. So while there is a larger rental assistance fund in this new COVID relief package, rather than add a tribal set aside there, they really put more resources directly to NAHASDA programs, which would be treated similar to a lot of your other typical annual funding that you receive. So there should be a lot of flexibility there. Out of that $750 million, 450 of that will go through the IHBG formula that we're all familiar with. $5 million for Native Hawaiian housing block grant, and then $280 million is in the bill for the ICDBG program, which would follow the CARES Act portion that we saw last summer, which was the non-competitive imminent threat type grant process, non-competitive. And there was some issues with applying through HUD. I think they're going to try to, they've worked to address a lot of those, and they're still in discussions on how they're going to treat this upcoming fund if it does get passed in its current form, to treat folks who applied for it last summer and may or may have changes to their applications that didn't get approved in that first round before that program round of money under the CARES Act. So a lot of money here for NAHASDA programming. Hopefully it's helpful for a lot of your programs out there across the country. And there is $15 million as well for training and technical assistance, and some admin dollars as well for HUD and other and training and TA. on top of the NAHASDA funding, there's a homeownership assistance program. So this is almost just like the rental assistance program that we saw in the January bill that you all received some funds for. But this is for mortgage assistance. A lot of you were asking if the rental assistance funds could be used for mortgages. I think the answer to that's been a pretty clear no from Treasury based on the statute that was passed 2 or 3 months ago. But now there's Congress is creating a program specifically for homeownership assistance and mortgage assistance and utilities for homeowners as well. So it's going to mirror the other program. It's going to be operated again by Treasury rather than HUD. I know a lot of you guys have been, asking HUD questions about it, and they've been part of the process all along. They've been on all the Treasury calls with us, learning about the program, and behind the scenes, they've been asking and advising Treasury folks on, how to best implement the program for tribes and make it effective and usable for tribes. So they are talking quite a bit. We're certainly, happy and grateful for HUD's assistance to Treasury because they're not used to working with tribes or tribal housing programs. So we're certainly encouraging them and happy that they're engaged in the process. But here in this COVID-19 relief package that's pending in Congress, there's a homeowner assistance program for $500 million. So it's a little bit smaller than the rental assistance program, but it'll operate very similar, utilize the IHBG formula that we've seen and are familiar with. One thing that I note here in the slide and what the text in the bill does, it does provide for local or national AMI when we talk about eligibility criteria. I know that was a big issue that we've heard in the rental assistance program, and on the congressional level, it does fix this for the mortgage assistance. I haven't gone back and looked at the text in this new bill to see if they are applying this retroactively for the rental assistance program. I'll have to take a look at that after this call or possibly when the bill gets its final form. But I know it's a big issue for the rental assistance program. I see some questions coming up in the chat, I think, but I'll go through the rest of this package briefly and then get to the questions and then open it up for conversation. This package also contains a very large fund for tribal governments, similar to the CARES Act last summer that had $8 billion for tribes. This portion has $20 billion for tribes, and this was, this is a sticking point for a lot of negotiations, state, local governments, and tribal governments getting funds. I think it's been committed that this is still a priority of the president and the leaders in Congress right now to still have that assistance for local, state and local governments and tribes. And it has a $20 billion fund attached to it. The program last summer did use the NAHASDA formula, which I know caused a lot of questions more than anything because, tribal governments receiving this money, they're not necessarily familiar, and elected leaders aren't necessarily familiar with the NAHASDA or IHBG formula. So they won't be using that formula under this bill. There's a provision that they provide separate or divide out $1 billion to tribes equally, and then they have their ongoing consultation that they've already started some discussions on what that might look like for the rest of that fund. So a substantial amount of funding for tribes and tribal governments through this bill as well. I know many tribes used some of those funds last summer to help housing programs and other forms that weren't part of the CARES Act for tribal housing directly. So, certainly encourage a lot of you housing practitioners on the call, housing professionals, to work with your tribal councils, tribal governments to see what can be done with some of the tribal funds that's being added directly to tribal governments through this bill. The COVID relief package has individual relief payments that we're all seeing in the news, $1,400 to individuals, eligible individuals, similar to the $1,200 and $600 checks that a lot of folks in our communities have been able to get and use in prior COVID relief packages. So more help and assistance on the way if this bill were to get passed, which we expect next week, I believe. Other tribal funds in the bill, non-housing, there's a lot of education funding, IHS funding, lots of other programs, tribal set-asides or small plus-ups, existing tribal programs at other federal agencies. So I didn't list them here. NAFOA has a good website where it talks a lot about, they have it all broken down from their review of it from a few weeks ago. There was a larger tribal leader webinar hosted by our partners at NAFOA. So encourage a lot of you to look at their website. We've been pointing people to that from our email messages that go out about some of these COVID relief packages. So hopefully you guys have seen some of the other funding that's coming to tribes as well, but it's not directly related to housing, so I didn't list it here. I'll open it up if there's any questions live questions from folks on the line, happy to answer what I know or, jot it down for future fact finding, and we'll get back to folks. But if anyone has any questions or thoughts on the COVID relief package, feel free to chime in. I'm going to start looking at some of these questions that have come in. Well,
Tony?
No one on the line?
Tony, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Denise.
Hi, Tony. So we have a question, and we're not able to. I'm here with the Isleta Pueblo Housing Authority staff, and we have a question that we're not able to see the chat, and we don't know if anyone's asked it, but we did pose it to the Department of Treasury, and we didn't see it clearly addressed. But has anyone asked the question of whether or not lease purchase units qualify as rental units?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's a bit of a gray area still from what I've seen from the FAQ. I think a lot of it will depend on, tribal policies and how tribes and tribal housing programs, characterize those programs. I know there's a lot of lease to own programs or rent to own programs that tribes have used over the years. When you look at the FAQs, it talks a lot about leases in particular, having that as a documentary evidence. And doesn't use the word mortgage. So I think to some extent, if your tribal programs are using that language and verbiage, and ownership doesn't transfer until certain trigger points, I would think that they could be fit under this rental assistance program. And I would work with your partners there. I know we haven't gotten a direct answer from Treasury on that in the FAQ. I believe they're working on more formal guidelines. In my last conversation with them, they said they may not necessarily release an updated FAQ, but they are going to move on towards putting more guidelines out there in some form or fashion, and really wanting folks to have that certainty that they need to, safely put this money to use and help people in their community. So I know it's a gray area. I'd certainly work with your own attorneys and look at your own codes and policies that you have in place. But if you're mirroring the language from the FAQ and you're talking about leases and those types of documents, I think it's a case can be made one way or the other. Hopefully, if there's a mortgage assistance program coming out, that's another mechanism that can help those types of homeowners or renters as well. How you guys classify those. Hopefully, that's not. Hopefully, the end result isn't that those folks can't be helped, right? Because if they don't fit the rental program, they don't fit the mortgage program, we'd be leaving people in a spot that they may not get assistance. Hopefully that's not the outcome here. We'll keep working with Treasury on that specific point, but a lot of it will be defined by how the tribal programs, classify those payments and, rental over ownership relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, and Denise, this is Dave Heisterkamp. I'm sorry you can't see the chat box because people are talking about this, but I think for the traditional mutual help lease to own, the way to think about it is until the end of the lease period, when ownership actually moves from the housing authority to the individual, it's a unit owned by housing, and therefore the tenant or the occupant or the home buyer is required to pay a monthly rent under a lease type of agreement. So if they're obligated to pay a lease every month or lease payment every month, and they don't own the unit on paper, then I think it's a rental unit for all intents and purposes and can receive rental assistance. That you look at the ownership and you look at the obligation of the individual to pay a monthly rent to stay in that unit. And those are mostly the issues that I think Treasury is concerned with here. So we've as long as it's that kind of traditional lease to own arrangement where the ownership hasn't transferred yet, we've gone ahead and interpreted that as an assistable unit under this program.
Thank you, Dave and Tony, and so have we here in New Mexico. We just wanted to make sure that, well, I wanted to make sure I didn't get my clients in trouble for doing that.
Right.
Thank
Never
you.
get your clients in trouble, Denise. Never.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah, well, I'll jump ahead on the slide here. So, I mean, what we talked about is the up and coming package. The next slide, if I can get to it with all these boxes open. The rental assistance program itself, we can talk about this for a little bit. So they did release the updated FAQ last Monday. It tried to address, and I think it does address a lot of the questions that tribes have had over the last month or two since this has been begun implementation. It was very clear tribes can pay themselves, acting as the landlord. Tribes can use the funds to pay the tenant's portion, even if subsidized by other federal funds, so long as you can document that there's no, duplication or double payment. It does allow the other assistance category that's in the law to authorize broadband as an eligible expense under the program. So a lot of these were helpful in getting this money deployed and on the ground helping families and people that need it. So I think the FAQ was definitely a great step in the right direction. I don't think the rental assistance program was able to resolve the national AMI versus local AMI, certainly in the FAQ. Like I said earlier, I had to check if the American Rescue Plan Act, which is the larger COVID relief bill now, kind of retroactively does that. I'll have to double check that. But right now, they're still using the local AMI, I believe, for that program, which I know a lot of tribes have indicated isn't the best or ideal for their programs. So I was still working with Treasury on that. There is a webinar. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I just one thing on that. There is a little bit of relief on the local versus national AMI, because what the new FAQ did under question number 4, Tony, it creates a new definition called categorical eligibility, which says if you're trying to assist somebody who's already got income certification on file in a federal housing program like NAHASDA or IHBG that's current as of January 2020 or later, you can rely on that income verification and that income, whatever the system is under that federal program. So in this case, NAHASDA, which does allow you to use the national or local median under the regulations under 1010. So if you're certifying your own tenants and your own participants, use that categorical eligibility definition and use your existing income files. And that's one way to get past the local AMI issue. Now, of course, that's only good for people that are currently in your program, and make sure you're not duplicating any services there. But for many on-reservation TDHEs, that's going to be a bulk of what we would say people are probably going to be assisted. That, of course, if any new person comes into the program who isn't a past participant and doesn't have a NAHASDA income certification on file, then yes, you're absolutely stuck with the local AMI rules till now. But I know that you guys have been advocating to change this at NAIC or to get some clarification. The National Low Income Housing Coalition is sending a list with that particular Indian country issue included this week back to Treasury, because we may or may not get some guidance in the next 3 months on it. But it sounds like there's a lot of awareness around this, that Treasury should just concede that TDHEs are used to doing this under the NAHASDA program and allow them to use the NAHASDA rules for any income certifications they might have to do for emergency rental assistance.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Dave. I appreciate that clarification, or maybe some way to interpret that FAQ and the language there. So that's really helpful. Another question that I know I've heard over the last month or two are rent deposits. The FAQ doesn't use that term specifically. It does talk about rental fees in a few spots, about other types of rental related costs. So, I think you can interpret that, I would say as broad as you need to encompass whatever costs are incurred by renters. So, but again, it's a question that we've got outstanding to Treasury. In a conversation I had with them earlier, they didn't mention the word directly, but they want this to be interpreted, I think, broadly in the sense that it gets money where it's needed. So, so long as I think as policies are in place at the tribal level that you really classify what are eligible costs, and certainly we'll keep talking with Treasury on making sure that we're not, adding costs that aren't eligible as soon as we identify them. But right now, it seems like the FAQ is leaning towards that type of cost being eligible.
Hey, Tony, this is Adrian. I got a question. If a tribe waived their rent last year, say April and May, is that recoupable through the ERA?
It'd probably be kind of a close call depending on the language that the tribe used. So I think if it's, formally waived and no longer even a rental arrear at that point, there'd be some gray area there and whether, that's still due by the tenant. I don't know if Dave, I know you've been working on a model policy, if that came up as a question, but I don't know if you came to any conclusions on that, but I think it'd probably be kind of a case by case on how the tribe is treated. If you've let that, arrear just, accumulate in billing or what have you for this whole term, but haven't formally, waived it, then I think it's an easier call. But I think if there's probably been a formal waiver of rent collection, it may no longer be eligible. But I'm not sure, Dave, if you had any other thoughts on that or if other conversations on that.
Tony, I think that's exactly the way to think about it. If the tenant no longer has the obligation to pay that arrears, whether it's been satisfied with CARES Act money or whether the tribe simply decided to not charge rent that month, then there's no arrears to handle with the emergency rental assistance. That it's pretty clear that the way Treasury thinks about this is there's got to be an existing rent debt. There's got to be some proof of that, either on a tenant accounts receivable ledger or by, invoices that are being sent out by the housing provider. But if the housing provider is the tribe and the tribe decided to waive that in the past year, then those months become unassistable because essentially there's no debt that the tenant owes at this time. So think about that. It falls back just like the homeowner situation or the lease to own. Does the tenant owe a debt, or is there is there a debt that's backdated in arrears? And if that's somehow been taken care of by other means, then there isn't anything you can apply emergency rental assistance to.
And I think I would add, and hopefully others can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the program does have a time limitation on the number of months total that any individual or family can receive the assistance. So if you're not able to apply, back rental arrears to, March or April or May from last year when this first started, because, you're already taking care of that some other way, that will help you still have the flexibility to help those families out for, those 2 or 3 months moving forward prospectively. Hopefully, unfortunately, this has gone on so long that, that time frame is really important as you guys craft your program. So, but, hopefully if you weren't able to use those funds for back rental payments, you're able to help those families moving forward. There was a couple of questions in the chat about policies and model policies, and a lot of us were waiting for this FAQ to be published so we can make sure what we're putting out there kind of conforms with that. We do have on the NHG website, if you go to our main page, there's a tab at the top that says COVID-19 resources. If you go to that web page on our website, it does have a tab there for policies that we've collected from tribes that we have collected or have provided to us and have said it's okay for us to share. And we're going to keep filling that up with other policies and tribal policies as we receive them. We don't necessarily have a model policy specifically, but I think these are all resources that tribes have been willing to share and can help inform other tribes out there who are willing to put policies in place. So certainly appreciate the tribes who have provided that or shared their information with us, and encourage others to do that. It'll all help get extra layers of review by people looking at these can only help us all make sure we're doing things in the best way. So you can go to our website. There are some policies there. There's only a few right now. We'll keep adding to it. And again, if you're putting those into place, feel free to share them with us, and we'll provide it as a resource as well. So I know there's some other questions going on in the chat, and appreciate Dave trying to answer some of those. So that's helpful as well. One there, would waive rent be eligible with IHBG CARES 2 in the proposed relief bill? Again, in this new bill, there is IHBG formula dollars that will go, and that would have the flexibility of it's got to be COVID related, I suppose, by the text of the bill, but certainly more flexibility under NAHASA heading than rental assistance specific funds. So again, I think it's probably kind of case by case, and probably how the tribe has already treated some of those payments in the past versus how you can treat them now. So, but there's probably some more flexibility there with IHBG funds than otherwise. I think we're caught up on some of the posts that I've seen on the chat. There is a Treasury webinar today. So I think it just got announced at the beginning of the week. We put it in our message that went out about this legislative committee call, but at 4 p.m. Eastern, For those who are grantees of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, Treasury has a webinar starting at 4 p.m. I believe you didn't have just an open link. I think you have to email them to get the link. I haven't seen one yet, but it's on the screen there. It's in the email that we provided out to members for this call. There's a webinar at 4 p.m. Put on by Treasury, and they'll have some official speaking there. And it mentioned having time for Q&A. It depends on how long that meeting goes. But certainly encourage people to participate in that. We'll pass along some of these questions that we've seen still on rental deposits, AMI, back rental arrears to Treasury as well. It's been a good back and forth dialogue with folks at Treasury and HUD chiming in as well when necessary and helpful. So certainly appreciate everyone's work on this. I guess I'll go back just real briefly if there are any larger questions just about anything kind of related to some of these COVID program funds. So this bill not passed yet, but we're hopeful that it gets passed early next week when it goes back to the House for their signing off on any revisions that the Senate makes. So any other questions about the COVID funds that you guys have already received or things that you've heard about in the news in this new COVID package? It's pretty robust package, of course, $1.9 trillion. That's been the talking point about, is it too big or is it targeted enough? But there's a lot of resources there for tribes across multiple programs, specifically for tribal housing. So look forward to working with everyone and make sure the funds get used and help the folks that need it.
Tony, this is Neil Wyckoff.
Hey, Neil.
Hey, how's it going? Good. Oh, sorry about that. Customer talk. The question I had is regarding, you had mentioned just very briefly about possible revision language in the new stimulus package to the AMI or national or local AMI. So is there a chance to advocate some of the committee members for that language to be revised, or is that since the Senate's going to vote today, hopefully, is it too late to advocate for revisions?
Yeah, I would suspect they're not going to make any changes to what the text is now in the rental assistance program there. And because tribes weren't in that language, I didn't really, look at it with a kind of fine-tooth comb to see if the changes they're making there are retroactive to that first pot of rental assistance money. I don't know. So I don't know if that change from local to national AMI is there. I mean, they were aware of it enough to make the mortgage assistance language have both of those options. So they were aware there. I just haven't gone back to check the rental assistance language there because it didn't. And it would be an open question, I guess, if it applies to tribes, since tribes aren't getting a set aside this time. But I'll definitely go back and look at the bill and see what the language there is applicable for the prior pot of ERA money. And if anyone kind of takes a review and has some thoughts on it, I'm happy to have that conversation. I'll take a look after this call. There's a question in the chat about, does stability services include purchase of laptops for counseling training? I don't know the specific answer to that off the top of my head. I think it's probably pretty broad in the types of services that can be provided, but I'd be hesitant to say one way or the other on this call without taking a little longer look into it. Like Denise, I don't want to get anyone in trouble either. But I'll take a look at the language. Well, I'll go on to the next part of the call here. There are some consultation efforts that are underway, and then we'll open it back up again. But there's, I would say, 3 consultations that are kind of ongoing or just starting now. And a lot of you I know have been on these calls that have had calls. But right now, so there's a consultation out for HUD housing counseling. So if you think back to 2010, after the last recession, there was a lot of financial bills passed there that had different rules moving forward, and one was on housing counseling and wanting to make sure that people are getting quality or adequate housing counseling, because a lot of that led to subprime mortgages and things like that. So there are new HUD housing counseling rules that have been applicable to a lot of other stakeholders for these last couple of years. Tribes have been exempt from it, and I think because we were exempt, the common thinking was that this consultation was really how to make tribes eligible for this new pot of housing counseling grant money that HUD collects or gets appropriated each year. But as we've learned in these consultations that happened, in January and February, it's a little bit more, it goes much further than that. It's trying to apply rules to anyone who does housing counseling. We know a lot of tribes do provide housing counseling services with their IHBG dollars. They have flexibility to do that under, any housing plans and whatnot. But here, because of the new law, HUD is trying to figure out how tribes are eligible. And unfortunately, the HAZA funds were specifically listed in that bill that talks about housing counseling. So it does fall within this larger umbrella. So HUD's trying to figure out the best way to do that, how to make tribes, fall under these rules in the best way that lets tribes still can carry out housing counseling services. Right now, the rules that were developed and in place, don't really fit tribes. They're meant for nonprofits and for state governments, and not necessarily how tribes can carry out or conduct housing counseling services. So there were two video consultations. They're both on HUD's website for review or replay. They're about an hour and a half, 2 hours each. A lot of comments from tribal housing professionals there on how their programs work and how the rules that HUD had adopted for other stakeholders involved in this couldn't apply to tribes as they're written. So there's a lot of feedback already. There's a written comment deadline for March 19th, Friday, March 19th. NIHC will share what we've drafted with folks if they want to echo that, if they want to make changes and submit something on behalf of their own tribe. But really just trying to highlight how the rules that HUD has in place now for other housing counseling providers won't fit tribal programs, and certainly argue the need that they shouldn't apply with NAHAZA funds having that flexibility. But there are some statutory provisions there that we're trying to work with HUD and how to best interpret to minimize the direct impact on housing counseling services provided by tribes. But then if possible, how to make tribes eligible as well for the housing counseling funds that are out there. So that's the first consultation. Another consultation that's ongoing is when President Biden came into office, he had a presidential memo directing all of the federal agencies to take a look at their tribal consultation policies and update those and have plans of action on how they're going to implement those or re-implement those. A lot of them were updated under the Obama administration, so they don't have to necessarily do a full, redraft or new rules for tribal consultation. But there was a good call with HUD last week or 2 weeks ago. Comments for that are due Monday, April 5th. I believe they wanted to do another video consultation as well, but I don't know if that's been scheduled yet. But that's an ongoing consultation as well on how tribes, how HUD should implement its tribal consultation policy moving forward. A last one, which I think was possibly just announced this morning or in the last few days, under the bill that was passed in December, January, the final omnibus bill. Part of that bill included making the smaller bill that would make tribes eligible for the HUD Continuum of Care program. And now there's an open question on what that looks like. How can tribes be brought into that program as standalone grantees? And so there's a video consultation that HUD is putting on Wednesday, March 24th as kind of a first step on implementing that. There was a Dear Tribal Leader letter sent out. You can get that from HUD's website. I'm not sure if that got included in our message or not, but it does have some questions there on that HUD would like to have answers or thoughts on from tribes. So on how best to include them in this program moving forward, as tribes are now eligible because of the law that was passed at the end of last Congress. So those are ongoing efforts now. We just want to make sure folks are aware of them. A lot's been going on these first few months of the year with rental assistance, catching up on everything with FY full year appropriations for 2021. So I know a lot of people are probably spread pretty thin right now. So just wanted to make sure people are aware of the issues that are out there. That's kind of the full agenda that I've got, because particularly in the Senate, they've been so busy first with the kind of impeachment trial. They didn't really get organized till after around the 20th or the end of January because of the runoff elections in January, the new administration coming in. They've been busy with confirmations for secretaries and cabinet officials. I believe Deb Haaland's confirmation process out of committee today favorably. So hopefully the full Senate will be able to take that one up soon. I know there were some questions there just because it's such a closely divided Senate on confirmation. I think things are looking better and better for her confirmation. We're all certainly supportive and happy for that. And hopefully that's something that comes up soon and from the full Senate. So I'll open it up here for questions. I got one just having me double check the housing counseling deadline. I believe it's in March. I'll have to check if it's been extended or not. I don't know if others have seen any notifications on that, but we'll send out any corrections or updated deadlines in the next NHU that we send out, and certainly before any deadline comes up. So but we'll double check those. I know there was a lot of conversation in those housing counseling calls, and it was great to hear, a number of tribal housing professionals on those calls really talking about how their programs work. And I think to their credit, the HUD housing counseling staff, they're not used to working with tribes and tribal housing programs. They're very aware of that and very, aware that they're learning about tribal programs as well. So they're coming at it from a very good direction, I believe, wanting to make sure that, everyone can work on this in the best way and make sure that tribe can still provide housing counseling services, because they're very needed in our communities. Obviously, it's probably the only place that a lot of our tribal members are getting housing counseling services in our communities as well. So certainly everyone wants the best outcome there. And so we certainly appreciate HUD's comments and taking all that time for those consultations to date. Legislative committee calls the first Thursdays of each month. Certainly try to do these advocacy email updates as well. Aside from the NHU, I know a lot of folks don't necessarily read through the whole NHU because we put a lot in there and you may miss some advocacy news. So we'll try to do standalone advocacy legislative update emails as well in the week leading up to this agenda, up to this committee meeting each month, and not just have the agenda, but have some text on the updates as well. So for those who can't join the call, they'll at least get a lot of the information there as well. Always happy to take recommendations or suggestions on how we can improve these calls. If you want us to reach out to members of the administration to have a Q&A, we'll certainly make those invitations as people would like. Certainly going to pass along a lot of the questions that we've heard today, particularly on the rental assistance program still to Treasury, make sure that they're aware that there's some questions there. Hopefully a lot of you folks are able to be helping your members with that. I'd be happy to hear some stories or issues that you guys have had if you've been successful in deploying some of this money to members of your communities. Happy to hear that, the good side of this program as well, because that's what we're always striving for, of course. Well, I won't take the silence. There's no one successfully providing assistance yet, but if there's no other questions, I think we can wrap up for the afternoon. Certainly appreciate everyone's time. If you do, of course, as always, you don't have to wait for these calls to reach out to me or anyone on the NHC staff. We're all working. Most of us are teleworking. I'm in the office today, but always want to be receptive to any questions you guys have. Like I said, we'll add more model rental assistance policies as we receive them and add those as a resource for other tribes to view and implement themselves if they need to. But certainly don't be shy about asking questions. I'll certainly try to get the answers that I know or find the answers to your questions as fast as we can and get back to you as quickly rather than waiting for these monthly calls. But appreciate everyone joining today. Any other questions? Well, we'll shut it down for today. I look forward to seeing everyone next month. Thanks, everyone.